When I was 26 years old, I moved into the main floor of an old house that had been divided into 3 separate apartments. The place was nothing special, but the rent was low and it included utilities. I just started a new job nearby and needed something within walking distance since I didn't want to get a car. The house was in decent shape, but it was clearly old. The walls had some dents, the doors creaked, and the hardwood floors were uneven in places. The radiators made knocking sounds now and then, especially at night, but it didn't bother me that much. I figured I would stay for a year or two, and then maybe take a step up. The landlord was a man named Don, and he lived upstairs on the top floor. He looked to be in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. He wore wire-frame glasses, and always had his shirt tucked in. He spoke quietly, almost like the soft talker in that Seinfeld episode. I had a hard time understanding him because of it, but that never worried me. When I moved in, he met me at the door, handed over the keys, and walked me through a few things. He showed me where to leave my garbage bins, and how to reset the breakers if I ever needed to. Before he left, we walked out to the main hallway that all the tenants shared. There was a staircase on one end, and a gray metal door at the other end of the hallway. Don said, "That's the maintenance room, don't go in there." I said all right, and didn't ask any more questions. For the first week, everything seemed fine. I worked during the day, and came home in the evening. I cooked for myself most nights, and watched TV, then went to bed early. I hadn't really made any friends in that city yet, so it was really just work, then I was home the rest of the time. I noticed Don's footsteps overhead at all hours. I heard him walking back and forth across the floor, sometimes late at night, and sometimes early in the morning. I started to wonder if he ever left the house, because I never saw him come or go. One night, just after 2 in the morning, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard a loud scream. It was quick, but it sounded like it came from somewhere inside the house. It lasted for about 2 seconds, and then stopped completely. I sat up and listened, but everything was silent after that. I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door, then stepped into the hallway and called out, but no one answered. The next morning, I saw Don sweeping the porch. I asked him if he'd heard anything unusual during the night. He looked at me and said no, and he didn't seem confused or concerned. He said it was probably a TV or someone walking by, then he went back to sweeping. That evening, I ordered a small motion-activated camera online. It had night vision, and it could record clips to my phone. A few days later, I set it up on a shelf across from the door to the maintenance room in the common area. I didn't know if I was supposed to do that, but nobody ever said that I couldn't. I wasn't really expecting anything, and I told myself it was just to ease my mind. I checked the footage each morning for the next few days, but the only things it picked up were normal. It recorded me walking to my apartment, the light turning on and off, and Don going to his place. There was nothing unusual, and for a while I figured I'd overreacted. Then on a Thursday night, the camera got something different. I didn't notice anything unusual while it was happening, because I must have slept through it. But when I woke up the next morning and checked the camera like I always did, I saw a motion alert from around 1 in the morning. I sat at the kitchen table with a coffee and opened the video on my phone. At first, the hallway looked empty, but a few seconds in, Don came into frame. He was wearing a dark hoodie and dark pants. He walked slowly, and behind him was a woman with her hands tied behind her back. Her head was down, and she didn't say anything. Don walked straight to the maintenance door, unlocked it, and let her through. Then the door closed, and the hallway was empty again. I watched the clip twice before I did anything, because I couldn't believe what I'd seen. The woman didn't fight or scream, so I wasn't sure anything was wrong. It could have been some weird role play. But after a few minutes, I picked up my phone and called the police. They arrived within 20 minutes, and 2 cars pulled up. I met them out front and showed them the video. One of the officers asked if anyone else was home. I said Don should be upstairs, but I hadn't seen him that morning. Then I gave them my keys to the front door and hallway. They went inside, knocked on Don's door, and waited, but there was no answer. A few seconds later, they forced the door open. I waited outside with one of the cops, and not long after, more police arrived with equipment. They entered through the maintenance door and went into the basement. It took them about an hour to find a hidden room. Behind a false wall in the basement, there was a small space that had been soundproofed. Inside was a bare mattress, some chains bolted to the floor, and a few bottles of water. The woman was there. She was shaken, but she was alive. Paramedics took her out to an ambulance. She didn't speak, at least not in front of me. The police arrested Don as soon as he was found, and he didn't resist. He didn't speak, he just looked at the floor while they walked him out in handcuffs. After the arrest, the police told me I couldn't stay in the house. They said it was now part of an active investigation, and they were going to search it thoroughly. One of the detectives arranged for me to stay in a furnished apartment across town. It was small but decent, and I didn't complain. They told me not to share any details publicly, and not to speak to reporters. Over the next few days, I was interviewed by investigators several times. They asked when I moved in, what I noticed, what Don had told me, and when I set up the camera. I answered everything honestly, and they said the woman had been missing for over 2 weeks. She lived alone, and didn't have many friends nearby. The police believed Don had targeted her for that reason. As the case went on, investigators looked into Don's past. He'd owned the house for almost 20 years. During that time, several former tenants had left without notice. A few were reported missing, while others were assumed to have just moved away. The police were going through old records, trying to identify everyone who'd lived there. It was possible there were more victims, but they didn't know how many yet. I never went back to the house, and most of my belongings were returned to me by the cops, though some were held as evidence. I left the city after about a month anyway. I quit my job and found a new place to live in another town. My name was never published in the news. The creepiest part is how normal Don seemed the entire time. He never acted strange, he didn't look dangerous, he was just so normal. I live in a different kind of building now. There's no basement, no strange doors, and no landlords living above me. Last summer, I had to move out of my apartment because one of my roommates moved away. I didn't really get along with the other one, so I was looking for my own place. I was checking online every day, and I was going out to see places a few times per week. One of them was a small detached studio behind a house in a quiet neighborhood not far from where I worked. Some people would call it a carriage house, just a small separate building that someone added for extra income. The photos looked fine. It was just a single room with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a private entrance through the side gate. The ad said cash only, no lease, which should have made me think twice, but I was running out of options. I just started a new job and didn't have great credit. My last place fell through, and I needed something fast, so I called the number. The guy who answered said his name was Victor. He sounded older on the phone, but I wasn't sure at the time. He told me to come by that afternoon, so I drove over after work. He met me at the gate, wearing a tracksuit and holding a can of soda. He walked me around to the back and showed me the studio. It was cleaner than I expected. The windows opened, the water ran, and the mini fridge worked. I asked about a lease, but he waved it off. "I've been burned by tenants before," he said. "Cash each month, due on the 1st. No lease means no drama. If that's a problem, I understand." That actually made sense to me. It is kind of a hassle doing paperwork, and I didn't mind dealing directly, so I said I'd take it. It was $8.50 a month, and I couldn't talk him down, so I agreed to that. I gave him first and last up front, and he didn't write anything down or give me a receipt. He told me to keep a copy of the ad if I wanted a record. I knew how sketchy that sounded, but I told myself it would be fine. The first couple of weeks were all right. The place was quiet, and Victor stayed out of the way. I'd see him once in a while when I came and went, and he'd wave from his back porch. I paid my rent in an envelope and dropped it through the mail slot in his back door. Then, about a week after my second rent payment, he showed up unannounced. It was a Sunday morning, and I'd just gotten back from grabbing groceries when I heard knocking at the side door. I opened it and saw Victor standing there with a folded piece of paper in his hand. He said that I'd shorted him $200 on rent. I told him I paid the full amount, but he said I gave him $650. Then I said I was sure I put the full $850 in the envelope. "Well, you didn't," he said. "I'm giving you a chance to make it right. You have until tonight, or I'll have to ask you to leave." There was nothing in writing, no proof on either side. I didn't want trouble, so I gave him the $200 later that day. I didn't like it, but I figured maybe I really did make a mistake. I started double counting the cash after that. Then it happened again the next month. This time, he said I was short by $300. I knew I wasn't, because I counted the money 3 times before sealing the envelope. I told him that, but he only got more aggressive. "You think I don't know how to count my own money," he said. "This is my property. If you can't pay what we agreed on, I'll find someone who can." I asked him to at least show me what he counted, but he refused. "You're not in a position to argue with me," he said. He was right about that. I had no legal ground to stand on, and he knew it. I gave him the extra cash just to get him to leave, but I started documenting everything. I wrote down the dates, the amounts, what he said, and when he showed up. I also started using my phone's voice recorder whenever I saw him outside. The third time he pulled the same thing, I didn't argue. I nodded and told him I'd give him the money later. Then I went inside and called a legal clinic I found online. They had drop-in hours the next day, so I took some time off work and went in. I brought a copy of the ad, the notes I'd written, and one of the audio recordings. A woman at the clinic listened to the whole thing and took notes. She called in a colleague halfway through. When I was done, they both looked at each other like they had seen this before. The woman said, "His name's Victor." I said yes. She said, "He's done this before." They pulled up some files and showed me. They were different tenants, but the setup was the same. Victor never filed paperwork or registered the unit. He only took cash, kept everyone off the books, and kicked them out whenever they complained. Then he'd rent it to someone new and start over. They told me not to give him any more money and gave me a list of things to do. I was supposed to keep recording him and not confront him. They also helped me file a complaint with the city. Apparently the unit wasn't zoned for living, and he wasn't allowed to be renting it at all. Victor showed up one more time a week later. He claimed I hadn't paid the full amount again. This time I let him talk. I asked him to repeat himself a few times, then ended the conversation politely. I got a full recording of the whole exchange. He threatened to throw me out and told me I was just a squatter if I didn't pay. I emailed the audio to the legal clinic that same day. Things moved quickly after that. A few days later, a city inspector showed up while I was home. He looked around the unit, took a few photos, and told me the rental was illegal. They gave Victor a notice to shut it down. He tried to fight it, but there were already complaints filed from other tenants. The city cited him for multiple violations: unregistered rental, safety issues, zoning infractions, and more. He got a hefty fine and a formal order to stop renting the unit. I had to move out, but they gave me time. The legal clinic helped me find a temporary housing program while I looked for something else. They also connected me with a lawyer handling a small group case against Victor. He'd done the same thing to at least 6 other people. I joined the case and handed over all my recordings and notes. Victor still acted like none of it was his fault. He tried to claim we were all lying, but the recordings made it pretty clear what he was doing. The judge wasn't impressed. Victor was ordered to pay restitution to several of us. I got back the money he'd forced me to pay on top of rent. Not all of it, but most. He also had to shut down the unit permanently. I heard later that he tried renting it again, under a different name, but someone reported him right away. It wasn't the worst housing situation I'd ever been in, but it was the most manipulative. I still don't know if he genuinely thought he could get away with it forever, or if he just didn't care. Either way, I was glad I pushed back. I ended up finding a place a few weeks later. It was smaller, but the landlord was decent, and everything was above board. I kept the experience with Victor in mind anytime I looked at listings after that. If someone refused to write anything down, or insisted on cash only, I didn't even bother replying. I was looking for a new apartment a few years ago, and I was trying to get something cheap. I didn't want a roommate, so I knew I would have to settle for something kind of crappy. I eventually found an ad for a place that was a basement suite, with all utilities included. The rent was low enough that I didn't ask too many questions, since there wasn't much else in my price range. When I went to see it, the house was a small residential home in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a regular house with a trimmed lawn and 2 garbage bins out front. The landlord, Carl, met me at the front door. He looked to be in his 60s, and he was soft-spoken with a bit of a limp. He asked where I was from and what I did for work. I told him I worked at a bookstore and was looking for something quiet. He seemed polite and easygoing. There were no red flags, and he was just an older man renting out part of his home. The suite had its own entrance around the side. The door opened into a small living room with a couch, a TV stand, and a kitchenette in the corner. A hallway off the living room led to the bathroom and bedroom. The layout was simple, but something about it felt weird. The hallway was longer than necessary, and one end ended at a blank wall. There was also a noticeable draft in there, even when the heat was on. I assumed it was due to poor insulation because the house was older, and it didn't bother me that much anyway. I took it on the spot and moved in just a few days later. Carl lived upstairs, and I rarely saw him. I heard his footsteps sometimes, but it was never constant or loud. I stayed busy and didn't spend much time thinking about Carl. Still, the layout bothered me. The hallway that led nowhere made no sense. One evening, I knocked along the wall out of curiosity, but it sounded solid, and I didn't find anything unusual. About a month after I moved in, I was hanging a framed photo near the bedroom door. I adjusted it a few times, and eventually, I got it looking almost completely straight on the wall. Then one night, I bumped it with my shoulder and it fell off the hook. The corner chipped, and when I picked it up, I noticed something strange. The wall behind it didn't feel like the others. I knocked lightly and realized it sounded hollow. The drywall was thinner than the adjacent wall. I ran my fingers along the edge and found a vertical seam. It was subtle, but definitely not part of the original construction. I turned on my phone's flashlight and looked more closely. There was a narrow gap where the panel didn't sit flush. I worked my fingers into the edge and pulled. Then a section of the wall swung open. Behind it was a dark, narrow space that clearly wasn't supposed to be there. I stood at the opening and held my phone up to light the inside. It wasn't a closet or any kind of proper storage. It was a narrow passage running between the walls. After a moment, I went inside. The air was cold and the space was cramped. I had to crouch slightly to move forward. There was insulation hanging loose in some spots, but I kept one hand on the wall and held my phone with the other. A few feet in, I saw a small hole drilled into the drywall. It was round, about eye level, and positioned to look into the next room. I leaned in and saw my bedroom. From that angle, someone could see my entire bed and everything around it. I moved farther down and found another hole. This one looked into the bathroom. I backed out of the passage and closed the panel. Then I stood in the hallway and stared at the wall. The space had clearly been added intentionally. Someone had built it to spy into the suite. I naively went upstairs and knocked on Carl's door, but he didn't answer. I looked outside and saw that his car wasn't in the driveway. Then I went back downstairs, locked the door, and called the police. 2 officers arrived about 20 minutes later. I let them in and showed them the panel in the hallway. One of them went into the passage and returned quickly. He said there were wires taped to the inside wall, running to a small camera lens positioned behind the drywall. The camera was pointed directly at my bedroom. They asked if I'd seen anything suspicious, or if anything in the suite had gone missing. I told them no. I said I'd barely spoken to Carl since moving in. The officers went upstairs to speak with him. This time, Carl answered the door. I couldn't hear the conversation, but they were up there for a while. Eventually, one officer came back down and said they were arresting Carl. They believed he had been watching the suite through a live feed. I didn't ask any more questions. I just wanted to leave. That night, I stayed at a friend's apartment. I only grabbed my wallet, keys, and phone before leaving. The police said they'd call me if they needed anything else. The next morning, I went back to get the rest of my belongings. A cop was already there and stood outside while a forensics team went in and out of the basement entrance. There was crime scene tape across the door. They let me inside for 15 minutes only, and I took what I could carry and avoided looking at the wall. Carl had been arrested for voyeurism and unlawful surveillance. They were reviewing the tapes to determine how long it had been happening. I didn't ask for details because I didn't even want to know. I found a new place about a week later with the help of a friend. It was a larger apartment in a newer building, and I had to have a roommate. The rent was higher, but I didn't care. The building had proper fire exits, smoke detectors, and security cameras in the hallway, so it was a lot safer.